One of the fun discoveries of recording all of these is I get to find out which segments of my class actually last a lot longer than I allowed in my syllabus, and which ones take less. During the semester, I can just let them run long and cover the stuff in the future class. But I have to record these videos all standalone, so some of them this one's going to be much longer, for example, than next week's videos, which will all be maybe less than 20 minutes. So we'll see. So we're going to argue against evolutionary psychology now. I gave some arguments in favor of it. And one argument against it is this thing that I found on Twitter right before I was going to record this. And this is somebody's bingo sheet for evolutionary psychology. The view expressed here, which is not immediately obvious from seeing the previous video, is that the scientific community has quite a big distaste for evolutionary psychology. I follow a lot of scientists, and there were a lot of likes and retweets for this particular post. A lot of people find some of the aspects and the people that associate themselves with evolutionary psychology to be dubious, perhaps problematically so. In the worst versions of it, it's just jerks trying to justify their own behavior based on what they think evolutionary history was like, or what they think is quote natural. So I'm not going to get into each of these, but they exist. So recall in the previous lecture, I talked about some of the three claims in evolutionary psychology. But there are thousands of modules that evolved by natural selection, and they constitute a human nature. Well, one thing that was I tried to argue for in the modularity lecture was that modularity made some sort of sense. But one of the objections that we saw was that it may turn out that modules could just as easily be explained by knowledge rather than processes. And in fact, there might be other issues. Evolutionary psychology presumes that there are behavioral solutions and psychological mechanisms that cause them. But in fact, you could have ones without the other. And you might even have just a general, learn to see what people in your environment do and how they behave. And one of the reasons we are really good at detecting cheaters, for example, is because our parents emphasize that. And if they didn't, maybe we wouldn't be that good at detecting cheaters in the cassava root study. That's at least an open possibility, according to some of the critics of evolutionary psychology. There's other issues with the view, and this was one I sort of glossed over and described when I said modern humans, are some 200,000 years old. And that is to say, you would recognize our ancestor 200,000 years ago as a human. But we were wandering around for millions of years before that. And when I say we, I mean our ancestors. But the interesting thing is the Pleistocene was this very particular small period of hunter-gathering. Life on Earth is 3.5 billion years old. Evolutionary psychologists really focus on this time period because that's when they think all of the social and psychological features appeared. But some people have pointed out that it's just as plausible that there were precursor mechanisms millions of years ago, or 500 million years ago, or whatnot. And in fact, how we perceive the world might just be our own take on these mechanisms that evolved significantly earlier. So the Pleistocene is an interesting spot to focus on, and perhaps it's not justified for everything that evolutionary psychologists wish to talk about. It's just what they want to talk about. The other is one argument for favoring the Pleistocene is that, quote, the majority of our lineage's evolutionary history was hunter-gathering, and evolution isn't that fast, but actually we do know that evolution can move pretty darn fast. So the previous argument, or the previous why focus on the Pleistocene, there's billions of years before it that could just as easily explain some psychological traits, let's say. But also, within 10 generations, that is 10 years, you can evolve completely feral foxes or completely docile foxes. This is research that was done about, I don't know, 80 years ago. Evolution goes fast. You can get big changes very quickly. Lactose tolerance, for example. In places where goats and cows were cultivated, humans evolved to be lactose tolerant. And in places where they didn't evolve, or they didn't have those crops, or sorry, those farm animals, it's very, very likely that we have lactose intolerance. And that's only been in the past couple of thousand years. So within a couple of thousand years, we've evolved an entire ability to process lactose, this sugar that is associated with the milk of other animals, that we can process when it comes from our parents when we're still weaning, but all other animals stop weaning at a certain age, and we just keep drinking milk for whatever reason. It's so weird, man. Nobody ever talks about how weird it is. Okay. So the overview of the objections so far. Why mechanisms? Why not just behavior? Or why mechanisms? Why not one big mechanism that is learn from your parents? Seems like an open question. Why focus on a particular time period? Because evolution can happen over much longer time periods and much shorter time periods. The Pleistocene is unlikely to explain everything, and yet that's the one that tends to be appealed to by evolutionary psychologists. Another issue is that it's not just evolution that is a process that happens in biology. There's a lot of other processes. There's a phenomena in development. So development is going from birth to maturity, actually even before and even after that. But there's what's called developmental plasticity, which is the same basic biological framework, the same genes, the same tissues can produce very, very distinct outcomes depending on their environment. So you could learn English, Chinese, Spanish, or French without having to have a module for English, Chinese, Spanish, or French. We're actually pretty well adaptable as humans. And lots of creatures are extremely adaptable. There's some really cool examples in this literature of like goats that lose their front legs early on in childhood that learn how to basically walk like bipeds. You can look up some of those images, they're fascinating. And some of these, quote, modules might be very simple, very, very, very simple mechanisms that don't involve deep psychology at all, right? You can see just 3 blobs, but one of them you see as a face and the other one you see is like a Dragon Ball leg or something. A lot of evolutionary psychology is focused on a study of a weird population. And by weird, I mean Western educated, industrialized, rich, and developed undergraduates at largely universities in Western countries. And you guys are a strange bunch. Um, you are not like humans in general. You're not even like humans in your neighborhood or in your um, that you grew up with. But the last thing, well, it's maybe not the last thing. I have to talk about onions at the end of this. The last thing is that there are things that appear to be traits that aren't actually traits, that we just fool ourselves into thinking are something that was there on purpose. And this happens all the time. So this is called a spandrel in the literature, and the spandrel comes from this architecture in Italy, in Venice, where you see these arches where there's lots of ornate drawings. So the analogy is made to biology. The spandrel looks like a thing that was put there on purpose in the same way, for example, that a chin looks like it exists. You look at a person and you're like, oh, you are a human being who has a chin. That is a feature that you have. But in fact, chins are the result of growth plates. They are, you have two separate growth plates in your face that at some point in your early development have to intersect. And they can intersect in a sharp jutting chin or in a butt chin, or they can blend into each other. But there's no gene for a chin. There's these separate plates that intersect. We think about them as a trait, but they are not. They're byproducts of other things that biology does recognize. And if that happens for biology, then presumably that happens in psychology as well. We think we have a cheater detection module because we have these distinctive patterns of detecting cheaters, but that might just be a byproduct of some other thing that we have, some other way of interpreting social situations. And it might just be that when we can imagine things, it's easier, right? So, all right, this is going to be the last slide. Evolutionary psychology makes certain assumptions about underlying mechanisms when you can just have behaviors. Doesn't quite explain that. It also doesn't quite explain why we should posit so many distinct mechanisms as opposed to just like learn from your environment mechanism. There's responses to those, of course. Some evolutionary psychologists will say that we get cross-cultural results, but a lot of the studies come from weird populations, college undergraduates mostly. Focusing on a particular time period, the Pleistocene, as opposed to earlier or later, seems to be a choice because it's easy for evolutionary psychologists to imagine what it would be like to be a hunter-gatherer. There's a lot of other phenomena besides evolution to pay attention to. And in fact, evolution has a lot of other products that things that appear like they are there through a process of evolution by natural selection, but are just there as a result of some other thing, like a chin. There is no selection for it. It just is a byproduct. And maybe not everything that needs a special explanation for why it's there. Lungfish here on the left and onions on the right have 40 times and 5 times more DNA than humans do. Presumably, we don't think that they need all of that to code for how complex they are. Not everything in biology is there because of evolution by means of natural selection. Some stuff is just there. And so evolutionary psychology, if it is an attempt to explain psychological features, is overly reliant on evolutionary processes that are actually just the glamorous ones, not the ones that are the majority of the things that actual practicing evolutionary biologists reference when they study traits in biology. All right, that's the end of this.